Welcome back show Caribbean Rhythm with Niccolo Soldo. It is said, Niccolo, that you are a Fed, and I believe the rumors, the way this started, is that you were smuggling cigarettes, as many of your countrymen are wont to do. You were smuggling cigarettes from Chicago to Toronto, and I hear this is why you are banned from the United States. And that you were caught, in fact, by the Canadian authorities, and that your whole forum and persona and everything is a trap laid out by the Canadian Human Rights Committee. How do you answer these charges? Answer now.
First of all, I'll say, Yebienti mater. And second of all, what I will say is that I've retained the services of a certain bureaucrat from Chicago who has taken down a fucking vicious gypsy smuggler. Now, my lawyer, who's sitting right next to me here, says that I can't say more than that. So you're going to have to be content with that answer.
Yes, the Eli, the famous George Eli. Every gypsy in America named Eli.
I'm going to get him, yes.
Yes, now we mentioned your forum, Salo Forum, has incredible content, incredible threads, information people cannot find anywhere else. And one thread of particular interest to many outside the forum, I've seen mainstream journalists reference this thread, because you've compiled there the inception, the history behind the inception of the AIDS epidemic in San Francisco. And in particular, this patient zero, Gaitan Dugas, I believe his name is, the first AIDS patient, and his role in spreading this disease. And I thought maybe you wanted to have 5 minutes or something to explain to general audience who might not know about the strange background of this AIDS epidemic.
I'm more than happy to do so. I'm going to try to keep this brief because I can talk about this for 10 podcasts. And one of the things that you find is that there are gays who went through this, gay men, that are very open about what happened because they feel that gay sex is just as valid as heterosexual sex, and they feel a historical obligation to explain what happened at the time, regardless of how it looks to others, and regardless of their sensibilities, even though most gays do not want us to understand what they were doing in those crazy days, especially in the 1970s. So what you had in 1970s USA is you had three centers of gay activity: New York, LA, and San Francisco. San Francisco is a special case because you had roughly 20 to 30% of the male population being gay men. It worked as a mecca for gays, especially the Castro district. When you put that many men in a location, when they're homosexual, meaning that there is no real barrier to sex because there's no woman to say no, men being men, men being incredibly hormonal, you're going to have a lot of sex. And when you have a lot of sex, and when it's unprotected, you're going to get all sorts of diseases. By 1977, a common topic of conversation among these guys was the various weird parasites in their stomachs that they were getting from sex. This is stuff that no one ever knew about. Some guys were getting parasites that were only found in sheep or lamb prior to that. So a lot of people think that AIDS, HIV, came out of the blue when that wasn't the case. What was happening was that these guys were engaging in so much unprotected anal sex with each other, spreading it amongst themselves, that they were exposing themselves to all sorts of things: herpes viruses, hepatitis, all these things. And they were compounding while they were doing this. And they still kept going at it because at the time, the philosophy was freedom. It was about being as gay as possible. I have actual quotes from gay activists at the time who will say things like, every STD we had was just another medal from the war for gay liberation. The famous joke at the time was, why do you go to the STD clinic? To get a shot and your next date. So these guys were stressing their systems, their immune systems, so much But at the time, everything that they had was easily tradable, usually by things like penicillin, until HIV came along. And that blew them right the fuck out of the water. You mentioned Gaetan Dugas. Gaetan Dugas was a guy from Quebec. He was a flight attendant. He was the one that was called Patient Zero, even though that was a misunderstanding. It was a misnomer. He was accorded that because the CDC did a cluster study, and he was actually really helpful in this initial study, which I think occurred circa 1982, 1983, because he kept a huge fat black book, an address book, of all the guys he was dating with their names and some of their characteristics as well, if he couldn't remember their names. Gaetan was very open to questioning, and he was very open to talking about his adventures, blah, blah, blah. His philosophy was that he wanted to fuck a new guy every single day. And the fact that he was a flight attendant meant that he was bouncing between places like New York, LA, and San Francisco. So he was the guy that was appearing in these various clusters simultaneously. So the fact that he was so open and direct about what he was doing ended up giving him a bad reputation, thanks to a book called And the Band Played On by a writer who was gay, who also died of AIDS later on, who decided to sex up his book due to editorial pressure by making Gaetan Dugas somewhat of a villain. Now, this doesn't exculpate Gaetan Dugas, because this guy was going around everywhere doing as much as he could, having as much sex as possible, and even when these conditions were hitting him, he simply stated, and you have this written down by the witnesses at the time, it's all on record, saying, hey, if they got it, it's not my fault, they should be careful. If I'm going to die, they're going to die too. So what? Along those lines. An important person in this is Selma Dritz, who was one of the heads of public health in San Francisco at the time. She's a tiny little Jewish lady, and she is an incredible source on this. She died a while ago. But one of the main primary sources I have for these early days is an oral history that the Stanford University put together, their library. It's called the Oral History of HIV, I think it is. But a lot of the material that I've culled has come from that. Selma Dritz and others, such as Curran from the CDC, or Dr. Forbelding from the San Francisco Clinic, I think, they speak openly about this. So this isn't stuff that people who can be accused of homophobia are saying. These are people on the ground who were very empathetic to these people, and a lot of them themselves were gay men. So when you read through this material, you read and you learn a lot about the shit that they were doing to each other. Classic example, when they started formulating questionnaires to figure out what kind of behaviors these guys were into, their first formula they put out is, do you consider yourself as someone who's promiscuous, someone who has a middle amount of sex, or someone who's not promiscuous at all? So in the first formulary, it was roughly something like this. 0 to 5 partners was, 3 to 5 partners was median, 5 and above to like 15 was promiscuous, and 0 to 3 was not really promiscuous. And then they started getting answers, and a lot of these gay guys were very open about themselves. And they would say, what are you talking about? We have 200, 250, 300 guys a year. So this culture, even though it was going on, a lot of people simply did not realize what they were actually doing to each other. And these diseases were compounding within their system, and added to the long gestation period, up to 10 years, a lot of these guys were hammering away while they were exposed to the virus, while they were carrying the virus.
Yes, very disturbing. And how does it relate to the name you're using now on Twitter, Fisted by Foucault?
Well, okay, here's why. Michel Foucault, now officially the world's most the person with the most citations in academic journals in history. Let's rephrase that. He was very much into this culture, very much into San Francisco, and he was very much into the S&M crowd, the sadomasochistic crowd. And one of the innovations, I think that's a fair word to use, of that crowd was a new form of sex. And I don't know if you can call it sex, but it is a form of sex because it's penetrative. And the way it would work was that a man would expose his ass.
No, please.
Usually,
People know what it is. No, please.
okay, all right. I don't want to get technical, but here's a quote.
Foucault, yeah.
It's a family show, yes. But here's a direct quote that'll tie into this from Selma Dritz from the San Francisco Public Health Board. Quote, now, there were gay men who were aggressively out, the S&M, sadomasochistic men, the leather boys we called them, who walked up and down Market Street dressed in leathers with leather caps like the old Nazi men and chains and leather boots. But they were the ones that died the fastest because, generally speaking, they were the most traumatic anal rectal techniques and got infected. They had been infected with many other sexually transmitted diseases before them, so they were in no shape even to postpone the activation of the AIDS virus after it hit them. So these guys were the most highly sexualized and the most sexually violent people around in that entire scene. They would even put off other gays. Michel Foucault was a legend in this. So when you read about Michel Foucault and his theories of imprisonment, his theories of violence, his concepts of violence, and the fact that he was a sexual sadist, it kind of makes sense. And when you realize that he himself was a sexual sadist who was actually involved in this and was an innovator in this, then you think to yourself, why is a sexual sadist, why does he have such outsized influence on our political discourse to this day to the point where it actually informs legislation? So why do I call myself fisted by Foucault? Because we are literally being fisted by Foucault.
Yes, I think so. Mr. CIA Foucault is such enormous influence in the fraudulent classics profession that you see extremely staid, boring, middle-class classics professors have completely assimilated all his opinions about ancient Greece, of which he was largely ignorant. He did not know Greek. He left France to study ancient Greece in California. It's absurd. And his vision of ancient Greek sexuality is so distorted and warped by his bizarre practices, but yet he has this enormous influence. And yes, I think you're very right. Someone rightly said that your name is a form of psychological warfare against the American crap, so-called crap elite, the ruling academic class. I think it's a very good name.
Thank you very much. I took inspiration for that name from Dominated by Doug, which is also an important text in Western literature. But at the same time, the woman who took your virginity, Camille Paglia, she considers Foucault a fraud.
Yes, Camille Paglia completely, she tried to peg me, but we cannot talk of this now. But yes, well, very good. I think on this note, we should perhaps, just for sake of superstition and not leave on such an ugly subject as our last interview matter, perhaps we talk about a place in the world where you find most beautiful women. What do you have to say about Gauguin's idea that women in Tahiti, Persia, and Sweden are the most beautiful in the world?
I have seen many Nordic beauties in my time in Europe. The amazing thing with Nordic beauties is that they can tan. Unlike Scottish or English women who burn upon impact, they end up having this amazing glow to their faces. And because they have such strong faces, offset by very light hair, they are stunningly beautiful. So you cannot deny the beauty of the Nord, even though you can be realistic about the, let's be diplomatic and say, not beauty of those from the British Isles. Of those from Polynesia, there is a femininity there, which I think the attraction in the 19th century is reflected in the online culture of the weeaboo and the glorification of the East Asian, particularly the Japanese girl, especially costumed and dressed up.
Yes.
I think that's a fair mirror. Now, the Persian, the Persian beauty, I rate at the top, at the very top. For me, the most beautiful woman I will list, and of course we have our own prejudices and tastes, and we often tend to prefer those that most look like us. But when it comes to the most beautiful woman, I found the Persians, especially in the Western areas. and the northern areas. Romanians in Europe have stunningly beautiful women, and also Argentina and Santa Cruz, Bolivia, the southern part.